Let's jump right into this explainer. Picture the late 1940s. The world is literally staring at the smoking ruins of World War II. But amid all that devastation, this quiet, incredibly powerful rebellion was brewing. Today, we're unpacking the origins of service. It's this fascinating grassroots movement that dared to ask a pretty radical question. What if everyday people could build global peace just by opening their front doors?
And that brings us to a really monumental question. Right after the fighting finally stopped, conscientious objectors, people who had literally faced prison time rather than pick up a weapon, well, they realized a pretty hard truth. Lasting peace? It requires a whole lot more than just refusing to participate in violence.
Section 1. From resistance to peace building, moving beyond simply saying no to war.
You see, in this post-war mindset, these activists had a light bulb moment. They realized they needed to move from just resisting into active creation. There is a massive, massive difference between pacifism, which is basically the negative act of saying no to war, and actual peace building. Peace building is the positive, roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty work of constructing a brotherly society, a place where international understanding can actually thrive.
Section 2 encounters sparking a movement, the catalysts of service.
Now, this movement wasn't born in some stuffy corporate boardroom, not at all. It started with passionate, everyday individuals like Bob Lutweiler. Growing up in that really uneasy peace just before 1939, Bob was a pacifist. He was a civil rights activist. And honestly, he grew super frustrated with always playing defense against violence. So he set out on what he liked to call a journey in the mind. He wanted to find his fellow travelers, people who were already actively building a peaceful society. Cut to 1946. Bob trudges up this steep hillside in Berkeley, California, and he meets Esther Harlan. And Esther, she is a remarkable character. She was an 80-year-old Quaker powerhouse living entirely off the grid in this rustic, vine-covered cottage. She affectionately called it her Stone Age cave. Despite having basically nothing, living without electricity, without heat, often literally giving her own blankets away, her home was an absolute hub of intellectual empathy and social reform. Every table was just covered in papers and letters.
And her dedication, it yielded a truly staggering result, 1,500. Think about this for a second. Decades before the internet or smartphones, armed with absolutely nothing but a rural mailbox, a typewriter, and this deep belief that Americans owed a debt to the world, Esther single-handedly built an analog Airbnb for peace. She miraculously gathered 1,500 open-door hosts across multiple countries, all entirely dedicated to providing hospitality for socially concerned travelers. Just incredible.
Part 3. The Roots of the Philosophy. Assembling the Pieces of a Peaceful Society.
Bob and Esther didn't just come up with their philosophy out of thin air. They essentially crowdsourced the very best ideas from existing alternative communities. It was like a giant puzzle. They took the international grit and shared heavy labor of work camps. They borrowed the adult education and cultural focus of folk high schools. They adopted the cooperative living and new work ethic from communities of work. And they grounded the whole shebang in the nonviolence, racial equality, and simple lifestyle championed by Gandhian and Quaker movements. Just picture this for a moment. Young volunteers right after the war, sleeping in haylofts, sleeping in tents under canvas, doing absolutely brutal, unskilled labor in war-torn cities. But by clearing that rubble and leveling those waterlogged fields side by side with locals, they made a massive discovery. Shared sweat was an incredibly powerful catalyst for true international camaraderie. Meanwhile, on the intellectual side of things, Scandinavian folk high schools provided the movement's heartbeat. These were definitely not your elitist, stuffy universities. Originating in the 19th century, they gave mature adults a second chance at education. Places like Askov in Denmark cultivated national dignity, but importantly, without that toxic nationalism. They became the absolute perfect sympathetic incubators for these early peace builders to gather, study, and debate what a peaceful society actually looks like. Which brings us to Section 4, the Service Open Door Model, formalizing the work-study travel system.
Once all these elements combined, the momentum was just off the charts. Remember, Bob met Esther in California in 1946. Just 2 years later, in 1948, he's traveling through Europe, exploring those folk schools and connecting with young German enthusiasts in Sweden. And then, boom, by 1949, they held an informal conference at Askov that officially launched the SERVAS project into reality.
And the entire model relied on this beautiful, radical, symbiotic relationship. On one hand, the travelers, they weren't tourists looking for luxury. They were conscientious seekers, studying cultures and bringing news. On the other hand, the hosts, committed peace builders who might only offer a simple shakedown on the floor or an uncomfortable sofa, but they provided genuine local culture. The currency here wasn't cash. They demanded an open mind. Make no mistake, this was absolutely not a sightseeing vacation. It was a rigorous work, study, travel process. First, travelers underwent extensive preparation, often doing heavy language study out of sheer respect for their hosts. Second, they traveled conscientiously, carrying specific letters of introduction. Third, they stayed with hosts and actively worked on local community projects. And finally, they were strictly expected to report back to the community on exactly what they had learned. Now, to keep things grassroots, SERVAS had very few rules. But there was one absolute non-negotiable requirement: a total rejection of racial prejudice. In the 1940s, guys, this was a profoundly bold stance. The founders explicitly stated they couldn't expose travelers of any hue to an experience of prejudice. Any host expressing a racial preference, instantly turned down. The network had to be fundamentally safe and welcoming for absolutely everyone. No exceptions.
Ultimately, the true cost of travel within the SERVAS system wasn't about money. It was a deep, personal commitment to international reconciliation and shared humanity. By living the reality of a recovering world, passing through family living rooms rather than anonymous hotel lobbies, these travelers proved something huge. They proved that everyday citizens don't have to sit around and wait for government intervention to forge lasting global bonds.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a question that honestly feels more relevant today than ever. In our modern era of instant, frictionless global tourism, have we lost something vital? Is SERVAS just another travel organization, or do we want more today? Maybe it's time we look back at this incredible experiment and challenge ourselves to view travel not just as a quick vacation, but as a conscientious duty to actively build a better world.